Good evening everyone and welcome to the September AES at SAE. It's confusing me already. If you're new to the AES lectures, Audio Engineering Society, we do these things every month. And the next one carries on the software theme. It's on the 8th of October at Broadcasting House, and it's about the Web Audio API. So there's a bit of a plug for next month's lecture. Before we get on to this month's, one more thing. If something catches fire, don't burn to death, just go out and follow the signs. And that's my legal obligation over with. I think everybody signed in when they came in, so I don't have to go through that. And everyone's here to listen to Iain Hetherington today talking about computer game audio. So thank you, Iain.
Cheers. Right. Yeah, so quick introduction as to who I am. I'm Iain Hetherington. I'm a sound designer. I seem to have a massively long job title all of a sudden. So I work for Creative Services Group for Sony. We're based in London, and I'm based in Gorilla, Cambridge, working on the Killzone franchise of games at the moment. So being like a sound designer in the games industry, there's not really so many specialisms in it. You get quite a broad remit, which might involve. Thinking about today, I started off having a conversation about how we were going to figure out a naming convention for dialogue, and then we were sound designing and mixing some in-game cutscenes, and then the next thing we're doing is like batch converting a bunch of dialogue for another game down in London. So I mean, it's fairly typical that a sound designer in the games industry jumps around and does quite a lot of different things. And so what I want to talk about today is what I believe is like the foundation of all these things. And that is that you can't think about any of these processes without really considering like the implementation side of things. How are those sounds going to go into the game, and how are they going to work in the game? So I wanted to kind of just start with like a short sort of analogy and think about like the way films are sort of thought about in terms of their sound. So the Oscars, for instance, award films for excellence in their sound editing and their sound mixing. And the way I've always understood those concepts is that sound editing is more the aesthetic style, how those sounds have been created and how they fit together to create sort of immersive world, something that's fits together to create a unique immersive experience. And then the sound mixing, which I'm not saying that it's like a purely technical sort of role, but something that's more down to making something euphonious, something that's aesthetically nice to listen to, something that's all the parts fit together nicely to create something that's pleasing to our ear. And so the question is what categories would you have for games? Do those ideas translate to that interactive environment? Where they do to a certain extent, what I want to try and do today is look at some examples which should try and show that there's a different element to all of this, and that is the idea of how these actual sounds are going to work in the game, the idea of implementation. And perhaps actually implementation could be the most fundamental discipline in game audio, in that you can't have the sound editing and the sound mixing won't really show their true colours without a decent underlying systems making those as prominent and as effective as they can possibly be. So the way I want to look at this today is to focus on FPS's, first-person shooters. I would say there's probably going to be a lot of gunfire and blood and all of those sorts of things. So if anyone's of a nervous disposition, then it's probably time to leave, maybe. So, and even more specifically than just looking at FPSs, I want to have a look at FPSs in the current time. So nothing, and the current sort of world as well. So nothing involving aliens or zombies or some sort of period drama type FPS. And particularly the two games I want to focus on are Counter-Strike Global Offensive and Battlefield 3, which are two very different games which go about trying to achieve quite different things. and with varying sort of results, but in different ways that kind of complement each other enough to be able to sort of give an idea about this underlying idea of implementation and the effect that it has on the aesthetics, the actual sound editing, the actual sound mix of the game, and more than that, the gameplay, the interactive element of games themselves, and how audio can be used to further those experiences and change the experience as well. So it's not just the how they're going to do things differently, but the why, the reasons that they choose to implement things in certain ways and all the rest of it. So I'm going to play a video of Counter-Strike Global Offensive, which is the latest iteration of this game. For those of you who don't know, Counter-Strike initially came from another game that was called Half-Life 2, and it was a game that the source code was freely available to the community, so people could take the game and they could manipulate it and modify it to create new games from it. And one of the outcomes of this was Counter-Strike, which is a very basic premise, is there's terrorists and there's counter-terrorists, and the terrorists want to put bombs and have hostages and those sorts of things, and the counter-terrorists just want to kill the terrorists, and that's basically it. So it's not an incredibly in-depth game. This isn't Citizen Kane or anything like that. This is purely shooting people in the face. It is literally where we're at with this. So yeah, I'm going to play a bit of an introduction.
Nice shot. Nice shot. Good kill. Way to go. You got it.
So I mean, that, believe it or not, is one of my favourite sounding games. It's like, if we think about it from that Academy Award kind of perspective, that analogy that I'd started at the beginning, like in terms of the sound editing, like how those sounds have been created, like they don't really feel that cohesive to me. I don't really think the guns have much character. I think some of the Foley's absolutely terrible. The ambiences don't really add anything to the experience. They're very quiet. They don't really. It's just providing a backdrop. So if the action stops, there's some sort of audio bed left there. But in terms of actual, you know, from a beauty side of things, it's pretty ugly sounding in many ways. And the mix itself, I mean, there's a real problem with not many variations in all of the gun sounds. And what I was trying to capture, which I didn't manage to do, but quite often in these matches, you'll have 16 players playing all at the same time, all with the same weapon, and they're all firing them all at the same time. And you end up, of course, with lots of phasing issues. And so in terms of the mix as well, is a gun when it's fired from this distance or from 50 meters away generally just sounds the same, other than it's attenuated slightly differently. There's minor amounts of filtering going on, but nothing really that's going to fix these phasing issues. So in terms of our general ideas about thinking about how this game actually sounds, it doesn't really fare too well. But, and I'm going to focus on more sort of smaller aspects of the game in general, but in how this is achieved. But the implementation of the sounds allowed the people to play the game better. There was a very short moment in that where the first-person character had gone through a small corridor and used the sound of the other player to localise that character to be able to figure out where they were so they could shoot them at some point. And that's really what I want to focus on as a main sort of cornerstone point of this, is the way that the sound has been designed as more of a gameplay feature than anything else. I mean, it's quite obvious a lot of those sounds perhaps haven't been thought about in terms of, like, from a technical point of view, how is this going to sound beautiful? But from a gameplay point of view, they completely change how you can play the game. So another video just to demonstrate that. Before I play it as well, I just want to make sure that we know exactly what I'm talking about, and what is the point I'm trying to make is that when the default position for the counter-terrorist and the terrorist is to run about, and they've got stuff to do, they're going to run about and sort things out. So if you want to move in the game and walk slowly, it's a choice that's made by pressing another button, sort of modifying your button presses to walk. And what is the purpose of walking? Well, I mean, if you're moving slower than everyone else, or you're trying to chase someone, it puts you at a bit of a disadvantage. But the choice that the sound designers have made on this game is to omit the footsteps completely. And although that may not be a completely realistic thing to do, what that's actually doing is giving a different dimension to the walking aspect of the game. All of a sudden you can move around without other players being aware of your situation in the world, and it gives you an advantage. So, I mean, sound is completely modifying the way that people can play this game and use it to their advantage.
Not kill our friends. I need help here! I need help! I need help! Planting. Bomb has been planted. Counter-terrorists win.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of points in there that I really want to draw attention to. So there was that moment where hidden behind some crates, and one guy runs through, and obviously you can hear his footsteps and you can pick him out. And then once he was finished and moving aside away from those crates and looking down the corridor, you could see another two guys. And so the first person ran around the corner, and one of the enemies came back around the corner. You could obviously hear him again, but at that point the first person decides to move back a little bit using running, so that that other person can track where he is in terms of space by the footsteps, but then halfway through decides to then move into walking, so totally silent. So from their perspective, listening to where this person is moving, according to their footsteps, it sounds like they've just moved a few meters back and are waiting on that ramp, where in actuality they've moved around the top. And then this next person can come in and they're audible and you can pick them off. And so the last point as well was that so you came down that narrow corridor and there was a teammate that got shot, and there was a guy in the corner who was running about, and there was thinking that was the only person, but in actuality somebody else had just chosen to be silent and remain there, and then just popped out while I was changing weapon, and so it made myself vulnerable. And not only that, by changing weapon or reloading or doing any of those things, you're indicating to the other player that certain things are happening, and so that they know if you're reloading your weapon, then it's a good time to all of a sudden spring yourself on them, because they're not going to be able to fire back. So, I mean, it's completely like a whole new set of rules about how to play a game, just because of one design decision within the sound. And to omit those footsteps in the context of production of a game is quite a bold thing to be able to do. It's so often that you'll have a producer who will be reviewing your work, and he'll point out that, wait a second, somebody's moving, there's no footsteps. It's the whole kind of, there's a plane, to put a plane sound on it kind of thing. But to actually argue and to take that to the next level, and to be able to say we're going to omit that and it's going to become a gameplay feature, is not something that's unique, but certainly something that was groundbreaking for Counter-Strike, and something that really demonstrates the ability of sound to play a part in the whole of the gameplay idea. There was actually, like, thinking back, I saw a guy talking about how narrative could do a similar things for games, and the way you were going to play them. So in fact, say Tetris, for example, if you were to bring in this narrative whereby you're filling trains to send people off to the concentration camps, and if you fill up a train successfully, then it gets sent off. Then all of a sudden, because you've added that narrative value to the game, then it completely changes your whole approach to it, your whole idea to it. And so it's that same idea that this idea of gameplay is completely open to manipulation from all of the different ways that it's put together. Much in the way that a film, you would have, how are we going to create sort of a realistic narrative sort of audio environment for it to take place in. I mean, this is something that's been talked about a huge amount, but the interactive element of games is something that's just another medium to manipulate within this sort of thing to be able to get that done. So what I was going to say is why does it sound weak aesthetically? And really it mostly comes down to these ideas of repetition, and the fact that it probably has never really been designed in terms of like, how are these sounds going to get created, what is their purpose, like, can we make it sound great, can we actually put some sort of character to it. So I think we're just going to watch another video that illustrates sort of the repetition that goes on and in various parts of the game.
Let's go! Let's go!
I think all of my videos are unnecessarily long to make a very, very small point, but we'll go with that anyway. And the point is the reason I wanted to show it in so many different environments is to illustrate the fact that there are reverbs in these environments, and they are mapped to particular areas. So if you enter a small corridor, then you're going to get a small corridor type slap back off the wall or whatever. But what they've chosen to do is omit that from any sort of real close first-person sounds, I guess, to bring them more out of the world and associate it more with the actual player character. But it just seems to exacerbate the problem with there being literally one sample for that nice withdraw sound. So every time he withdraws it, it's the same sound repeated over and over again. And not only that, that's an action that happens quite a lot in the game as well. And you know, I mean, if you were doing that in real life and you were, well, actually, it's kind of a point I'm going to make next, but if you were going to be slashing a knife against a wall, for example, and you were going to do it over and over again for an hour or so, say, like, okay, you would probably get bored of that action happening, but I don't think you would be bored of the actual sound of the knife hitting the thing. I think you would just be bored of doing it. So I think it's time for... That's what I've been up to for the last week, preparing the... doesn't really get any better than this either. But, so, yeah, well, as you can see, I mean, the impact sounds are so limited. Then again, I mean, there is the argument that it's not a physics game. It's not about interactions with knives hitting walls and stones and people. It's, you know, it's a game about shooting people in the face, which means that, you know, it's perhaps fine for those things not to have loads of different variations. But what makes it even more disappointing is the fact that the guns and the handling of the guns and the Foley, the things that you're listening to the whole time, there's little to no variation in those factors too. So I wouldn't say that it's a game where sound has completely not been thought about at all. It's just been thought about in a very, very different way to how people, sort of auditory people, would think about sound. I'm not exactly sure of Valve's inner workings. Valve are the company who created this game, and they're quite secretive in the way that their structure works, and supposedly different people can choose to work on different areas of the game, and they just move their desks around and they choose whatever they want to do. So it is quite possible that somebody just created these sound effects from a game design perspective, and they didn't really know what was involved or how you would go about that. And but the point is it's just a completely unique and different sounding game, and like with a totally different perspective. But what I want to talk about now is the next game that I said I was going to focus on, which is Battlefield 3, which is completely the opposite in terms of what it's trying to achieve, the way they've gone about doing it. But at the same time, I mean, it's still a first-person shooter. You've still got a gun in your hand. It's still about killing people, blah, blah, blah. But, I mean, arguably, it's held up there as perhaps the greatest sounding video game to date. And it is a remarkable technical achievement, the way that the sounds have been recorded, the way they've been put into the game, the way it mixes itself. It's, I mean, it's phenomenal. So I think just an intro video to this.
Enemy helicopter spotted. Over.
There's so much more going on in this game than Counter-Strike. So I mean, you know, it's really trying to recreate that filmic soundtrack. And I think that's a dangerous thing, because I think it's become more of a selling point than it has an actual sort of something to attain. I think that the purpose of this game is to recreate sort of a battle environment. Maybe not a literal battle environment, but more of a Hollywood type battle environment. But either way, the sound experience there is to fill in the gaps. So it's creating this atmosphere with all these helicopters and tanks and gunfire and everything going on at once, and it still plays a role in the whole gameplay experience, but in a slightly different way. So in that clip, like basically the first person is helping to catch that checkpoint with the flag that's moving down, and you have to wait there long enough and then it becomes your checkpoint. But at the same time, there's about 5 other checkpoints within this area that are perhaps not being thought about by the enemy at that time. So you've got 2 factions. In this game particularly, there was 64 players, so there's 32 players on either side with you've got tanks, you've got planes, you've got helicopters, you've got various other like military vehicles such as dirt bikes and quad bikes, and then you've got 4 different types of soldier that you can choose from, each with their own array of different weaponry, whether it be sort of light machine guns or larger submachine guns, and and sort of rocket launchers, and you know, just a huge variety of things. And not only that, within each of those weapons, there's so much variety in terms of the sound themselves. I mean, there wasn't a huge amount of gunfire from the first-person gun at that point, but I mean, I think it's pretty explicit how different and how much more natural those guns sound as compared to the ones in Counter-Strike. I guess let's see where we are with this. Footstep gameplay of Counter-Strike Go would not work in this environment. I mean, you can kind of tune these games to be a little bit more like the game format of Counter-Strike. So you can have 16-player maps, 8 on either side. You can have infantry only. So you're limiting all of this other stuff that's going on. But still, because of the way the game is mixed and how much more you can hear going on, and the fact that, you know, the footsteps thing, it wouldn't necessarily be apparent. It's much more of a hectic experience. You're not focusing on these little things. It's more about, you know, being involved in something much more complex. And the mix itself is not implemented necessarily strictly for gameplay, but for fidelity. Now, Battlefield was one of the first games to implement what's called an HDR mixing system, which it means high dynamic range, basically. And what it involves is you've got the dynamic range of the system, and you have a window inside of that which determines the priority and the possibility that things will play. So, and it's based on the loudest sound that's happening at any one point. So if there's an explosion, then that becomes the loudest sound and the window moves up. Now what that means is if there's nothing going on, then you will have the window sitting right at the bottom of the dynamic range. And you'll be able to hear things like, you know, the soft ambiences, maybe some wind blowing. You'll be able to hear the footsteps, and you'll be able to hear your cloth or insects or whatever else you might have in there that's super quiet. But as soon as you get that explosion and the window moves up, then everything below this lower threshold will be culled and you won't hear it whatsoever. This is kind of dealing with a situation that we have with games consoles where they're forever getting more and more powerful. We're dealing with larger and more unmanageable numbers of sounds. These mixing systems are dealing with a mix of sounds that you can't be sure of what's playing at what time or how many sounds you've got. Some of these systems can play back 256 sounds at any one time. And if you think about it, and you've got 64 players on a map, and they're all just say walking, I mean, from that you can have the footstep sounds, the Foley sounds, which might be broken into different parts, and like quickly with, you know, it's only 4 sounds per player, and you've already filled that criteria without having any music or ambience, or let alone helicopters or anything else that might take huge amounts of voices itself. So it's kind of managing that huge expanse of what's going on and kind of limiting it to create something that sounds good, that just doesn't sound a complete mess. So, I mean, technically it's just absolutely far superior in a completely different format as well. And so, I mean, I guess another thing is the way that the whole production has been thought about in terms of how these sounds are created and how they're put into the game. So it's not just, say, I mentioned briefly like the distance and how distance is dealt with in Counter-Strike with the weaponry. So it's just attenuated dependent on how far it is, and it may be filtered a little bit and perhaps a bit more reverb, whereas actually it's built into the whole production process of the audio for this game. So say, for example, explosions in Battlefield 3, what you notice is they're completely different samples when they're at distance. I believe their ideology goes along the lines of when things are close and firing weapons, most of our experiences come from Hollywood. We don't tend to fire those sort of weapons ourselves. We don't, you know, our experience of those is watching like these big bombastic films. Whereas explosions at a distance and gunfire at a distance we're more likely to experience on a more frequent basis by watching television news reports, for example. So it's this kind of realism distance trade-off whereby explosions that are close by sound big and fantastic and Hollywood, and then distant explosions and gunfire sound more like the popping and clacking you get, you know, nothing too crazy and massive and incredible. And so that just can't be implemented from nowhere. You have to think about where these samples come from right from the beginning, and think about the whole process of acquiring those sounds, going out and recording them in a certain kind of way, and then thinking about how they're going to actually be implemented in the game. So this is what I mean by implementation being like this fundamental idea at the basis of everything you can do in a game. Because without thinking of those ideas in the first and foremost, how are you meant to go out and record for these systems? How are you meant to consider all these different points? So I think we're actually getting fairly close to the end. So I've got another couple of videos, and then there's definitely some time for questions, I think. So this is looking at similar videos as we did in Counter-Strike, but comparing how they dealt with the same kind of issues. Another pretty exciting video. They're all on YouTube if you want to watch them again and again. So the, I mean, you can still hear that it's the same samples again and again in a lot of situations. Obviously, there's a lot more variety with this game. But what they've also done is broken down the sound into smaller components as well. So it's no longer just the impact and the swiping sound. You've all of a sudden you've got like the Foley's broken down into a number of different components. You've got the actual impact itself, which is a combination of the sound of the metal and the sound of what's being hit as well. So you notice with that wood at the end, there's that resonant tone along with a more standard kind of metal sort of clashing type sound. And so when you've got say 5 variations of each of those, and they're all getting selected randomly and put together at different times in real time, then you're just absolutely exponentially increasing the number of variations that you have from what is still quite a limited base, because you're mixing together and designing those sounds on the fly. Well, you're not in a way that the game is defining how that happens. And the other thing is repetition, which is something that Counter-Strike had a bit of an issue with as well, and that is anyone that's used Max MSP and is familiar with the different types of ways of selecting random, for example. So you can just have selecting numbers at random, and you can have 5 samples, and it might go, well, select 2, select 2, select 3, select 2, select 2, and maybe not select 4 and 5 and number 1 for ages, and just keep repeating these, and then all of a sudden you lose that sense of, you know, something different's happening all the time. And, you know, our ears are obviously very sensitive to repetition and rhythms, and those sort of things can come out very quickly, especially in things like footsteps. So something that's much more well, something that's better implemented here is that they use like a history type random, which says don't repeat any of the last 2 samples played or something to that effect. Or there's also like the numbers in a hat type of random, which is you pick out all of them before you can put them back in and start again. So all samples have to be selected. The problem with those sort of systems is, again, what you can end up with is if you don't have enough numbers in the hat, then you can get like the repetition of form. So if you pull out 2, 3, 1, then it could come out 2, 3, 1 again, and 2, 3, 1, and keep doing that, and then all of a sudden you've broken illusion again. So it's this whole idea of like, you know, balancing those ideas of random and selecting the right one for the right context. Reverb and environmental effects play a bigger part. So I mean, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. I think the reverbs are much more prominent in the mix anyway. But in terms of environmental effects, I mean, what I really like about this game is the fact that the old approach to designing sound ambiences for games has always just been to have like a stereo track that repeats and, you know, plays over and over again, like one track on a CD repeating over and over. But, you know, again, our ears pick up on that. So if you've got one bird call that's 2 minutes into the 6-minute piece and it goes over and over again, you're going to start noticing that happen again and again. And so like what they do is introduce different sounds like sirens passing by with Dopplers maybe, and, you know, these different things that come in randomly over what it can quite often be a non-distinct bed. And actually the sound of the environment coming from things in the environment rather than kind of just superimposing some sort of thing on top of it. And, you know, I think it's kind of been a limitation in terms of, you know, we haven't got the resources, whether it be RAM or the CPU or the, you know, back in the day, the number of voices, we couldn't play all these different sounds at once. But now we can create actual worlds that have sound ambiences that are the product of the items in those worlds, as opposed to just those simple linear tracks that repeat over and over. So I mean, with the first, the swipes, I mean, I think there you can really hear that the Foley's completely broken down. You've got these little swipe sounds and the little metal sounds, and sometimes they play and sometimes they don't. And that could even be a bug with like the way that the voices are allocated might not be, the voices might not be coming free quick enough for the next one to be played, or it could be done by design. But either way, that's another way that, you know, people think about designing sounds for games, is that sometimes maybe you don't need that variation in there. And but, you know, it's all these different layers and sort of layering up that randomization, having them all come together, that really creates like a completely new amount of variation that's just not possible with one sound that you've recorded 5 versions of. And at the end, where equipping the rifle and back to the knife, you actually notice that when he equips the knife, just as in Counter-Strike, that it's actually just one sample that plays over and over again. So, I mean, is that an oversight? Well, I mean, actually, when you play this game, if you want to come up behind someone and stab them, then it's just a one-button press sort of thing. So you will just come out and stab that person and then grab your gun again. It's quite unusual for somebody to actually decide, well, I want to equip my knife and then run around in what is essentially a gunfight with a knife. So what is that sound even that important? Is there any purpose to it? Like, does it matter that there's one sample? Perhaps not. And let's just make sure we're not getting ahead of ourselves. You know, it just, sometimes you can just focus on these little details and it actually doesn't make that big an impact in the game. So what would be the point in wasting resources on something that's really not going to get played back that often? So basically, as a summary to all of this, and this is something I guess that's shared across most industries in whatever field that anyone could ever work in, but you know, what purpose is your sound design intended to fulfill? You know, whether these two games have gone about, you know, creating an atmosphere and a sound design for two different games which essentially the gameplay is exactly the same. You're a person with a weapon and you're running around, but they've gone about trying to achieve completely different things. And until you've figured out actually what you're intending to do, then you can focus on where you're actually going to put your energy and you know, how you're going to go about doing it. And the way you choose to implement the sound will determine that outcome as well. So it's where if you're just going for a purely gameplay type thing and it turns out that, you know, stealthing about in an environment is a massive part of gameplay, then you're going to have to think about your audio from an implementation perspective of how we're going to support that type of gameplay. Is there anything else we can add to it? Is there some way we can sort of improve the gameplay experience? And in some ways, is there any way that we can harm that gameplay experience and actually make it worse? So, for example, on the game that we've just finished doing currently at the moment, in the multiplayer type maps, we were having these problems where footsteps and reload sounds, the radiuses on them were far too big, so that people were aware of where people were from much further distance, and so people with high-powered weapons could pick people off. Despite being, you know, completely on a different side of the map, it gave an unfair advantage to those with weapons that were more effective over a larger range. And so, you know, that's basically the crux of what I'm getting at. And poor implementation can mean bad sound design as well. I mean, we saw it in that moment that, you know, the reason I put the stabbing of a person in over and over again was because of the vocalization. Obviously, you know, our ears are intended to listen mostly to other people's words, and so we are even more affected when we hear repetition of the exact same sample when it's a vocalization from a human being. And so when you notice in that example that there's, I don't know what, 3 or 4 different reaction sounds getting played over and over again, then, you know, we're completely sensitive to that. And it doesn't matter if those sounds, they'd got the greatest actor on earth and they'd recorded him in the most beautiful room that perfectly represented the context in which that was going to occur in the game, and they'd worldized it beautifully, and they recorded it with an amazing microphone through the most beautiful Neve channel strip you'd ever heard. If you're going to play that sound over and over and over again, it doesn't make a difference. The bad implementation will lead to bad sound design. So that's basically it. So I guess it's if there's any questions or anything else.
Do we have a question, Mike? Yeah. And do we have any questions?
Hey, you talk about repetition in impacts as being a key issue. How much of your design workflow revolves around using samples, and are you exploring any other techniques such as procedural
really
generation or a combination of both?
Yeah, definitely. Because I mean, the thing is with a lot of these things, I mean, they're not, as I said earlier, like they're not physics-based games. Like the physics sounds aren't the focus of what's going on. And a lot of the time we find ourselves going through the same things again and again. So it's okay, we'll go and record some stone impacts and we'll go and record some wood impacts. And, you know, obviously there's no point in keep doing this every time. But so the new ideas that are being explored are in terms of physical modelling. So, I mean, it's a computer game. Well, this whole environment is just built up on maths and physics. And, you know, these interactions are already being described in terms that they can quite easily be translated to the physical remodeling of these sounds, and they are certainly things that are getting looked at. I mean, the real thing that we've always come against is CPU time and just the actual horsepower to be able to do that on the fly. The other side that always slightly concerns me is perhaps you'll be taking too much of the design away and just leaving it to an automated system. And already, like as I was talking about, like the complexity of these mixing systems for a game like Battlefield. I mean, there was a project I was working on fairly recently, which is a similar sort of thing, that you end up with a sound that you've designed that exists as a WAV within the game, and that's, you know, you've mastered it to a certain level. But then that's getting played back by like the sound engine, and there might be 3 different layers at which you can attenuate or change the volume of that sound just within that system. And then it goes off to the mixing system, which might decide that I'm going to turn that sound down because it's further away and I think it's less important based on some other parameter. And all of a sudden you might have a chain of 7 different gain stages for one particular sound. So it's sometimes it just gets a little bit out of control. And at that point, you just got to start reining things in and think about, you know, do we know how this is going to sound? Do we know the sort of outcome of it? And that's really one of my main sort of concerns about physical modelling in the future. But certainly as a quick way to generate these sounds and get the job done, yeah. Because, you know, if it's not, and that's the other thing, if it's not like a main sort of feature of the game that has to be sorted out, then it leaves you more time to focus on other things, perhaps the guns or whatever else. Does that kind of answer your question? Cool.
Thank you. 2 questions. One is, at what stage of game development is a sound designer brought in?
Probably never early enough, I don't think. I mean, it's been getting better. It's generally something where it's understood more and more now, the sort of the contribution that sound can make to the overall game, and particularly things like Counter-Strike and things like that. And you know, doing those things completely from a gameplay point of view. Like sometimes you'll be speaking to a game designer who has a completely different take on the sound should work, and it's actually those complete separation of audio people and the audio system that can lead to us being really focused and blinkered in terms of the way we go about doing things. And you know, games are software. They're bits of technology that are always advancing, and that's I think one way of making sure that we don't advance is just to stick together as audio people and to not actually sort of think about the way the whole thing works. So it's definitely more important to be involved early on enough in the development of a game, but it's probably still not the case that it's early enough. I would say that, when they're prototyping new ideas, and it might be for, say, a completely new system, a new piece of hardware, say for PlayStation 4 that's coming out very soon, is that what you end up with is they work out the technical limitations and what that piece of kit's able to do, and then kind of think about how they're going to make their game work on that system, and it's always kind of an afterthought. You know, what is the computational power that we're going to have left over for audio, and yeah, so we're quite often left fighting for that.
And secondly, how do you record your samples?
There's kind of a bit of a push. I think it's because it's kind of quite a corporate way of doing things. Is that kind of we have large libraries of sounds, and that's quite often where the source data comes from. But again, it's kind of that mentality whereby you can have a resource that's there that you can use, and it's always going to be relevant. Which I was having a conversation earlier with perhaps microphone techniques such as mid-side, which all of a sudden have this idea of post-production and being able to manipulate things after the fact, which seem almost perfect for an interactive environment. And I find it quite strange that those sort of things haven't yet happened. And maybe it's a processing thing, and maybe it's like, you know, not encouraging people to go out and record enough, or so yeah, it's nice to be able to tailor your ideas and get that whole process involved, from recording to putting it in the game.
And finally, is the sound always accompanying the video, or are some sounds stored in RAM for recall when they're wanted?
It's mostly stored in RAM, with the exception of things like ambient streams, so the ambient sound that goes on in the background, and music, they're quite often just streamed off the disc because they're just too big to fit in RAM. So at the moment with PlayStation 3 and Xbox, the average sort of audio RAM that you've got to use at any one moment in time is about perhaps 20 to 30 megabytes. So that might have to encompass a whole level, which could be 15, 20 minutes of gameplay, maybe even up to an hour, you know, so it's not a lot of audio. I mean, obviously we compress things down, but yeah.
A good couple of minutes of audio, even under.
Yeah, but yeah, well, it's making sure you focused on the right bits that are going to get played over and over again, I guess. And, yeah.
Well, my question. Does anyone else have any questions? Yeah. Oh, good.
Just a little question. Clearly, we see the processing power increasing all the time. Do you try and define the minimum processing power that is required to play your games?
Well, I mean, because we're working with Sony, who is also the hardware developer, that means that it's you know, the bar is set, and that's what it is. The different roles that you get within an audio team are the sound designer, such as myself, and then you'll have an audio programmer. So my level of things is quite high level. I don't get into the nitty gritty. I don't code. I don't know how to do that, but I'm a sound designer. I create the sounds and I put them in. I control logic and think about how they're going to work. So in terms of like knowing how many clock cycles it takes to implement these things, and I'm not the right person for that, unfortunately.
Yeah, nevertheless, it's clearly a thing that makes people go out and buy more powerful machines.
Definitely, yeah. And with PCs, you see that because they're more of a modular, upgradable system. People upgrade those as they go. But with something like PlayStation 3, for example, it's set in place and it's been there for 7 years or so. So it's constantly trying to squeeze as much as you can out of it until the next iteration comes along. Yeah.
You said quite rightly that reverb is quite important to the gameplay, and you also said there's a bit of a disparity between the sound designers and the programmers. Who has control over the reverb? Do you have any influence over that?
Yes, I mean we've been. Well, we have a reverb to use that just has the same sort of parameters of any sort of reverb that you'd have in your DAW, and what we do is we map the areas in terms of geometry. So in this room, we would create a polygon that would represent the shape of this room, and then assign a reverb that would fit the room. And then we do another one for the corridor, and then another one for the staircase, and so on and so forth. And then we can tune each of those. But obviously, you know, that's a time constraint as well. So I mean, it won't be about tuning different rooms perfectly, each one. It'll just be, well, okay, that's kind of this reverb preset, we'll push that one in. I mean, there has been a lot of talk about trying to process in real time and work out early reflections based on where it's happening and the shape of the room and everything else, but it's just, we don't have the clock power for that. We don't have the clock, yeah.
And will you come November time?
I don't think so, no. I mean, again, this is, you know, it's quite a technically in-depth kind of consideration to be making, but it doesn't appear like that's going to be something that will happen too soon. I mean, even with the physical modelling aspect, it is starting to happen now already, and there's sort of middleware. There's a particular type of middleware called WWise, which is just like a piece of software that sits between the game and the sound system and determines how those things are going to get played back. And that's now included with a module called SoundSeed, which allows generation of those sounds in real time. But it's still quite limited, and it's not always convincing as well. So.
With regards to the speaker setup, what kind of listening environment is it tested in? Is it like stereo or quadraphonic or surround sound, or is there like, are you pushing to like more like the 3D sound?
Again, I was having a conversation earlier about this sort of thing. I mean, it's mostly driven by consumers, so it's what they've got. And with PlayStation 3, it's a maximum 7.1 setup. We tend to do most things in 5.1. We have a 7.1 studio. That's where we mix things, but. Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, there was talk about originally the PlayStation 4 having 9.2 channels. I don't ever know what happened to that. That just seemed to come about and then disappear pretty quickly. But I think the truth of the matter is that in terms of consumers, they're going to drive it, and you know, there's a much bigger percentage of people now with 5.1 systems, but 7.1 systems. And like, does it warrant the development time to, you know, add that kind of in? Most of the time it'll just be, you know, we'll send those surround channels to the other channels and just be done with it, you know, because, I mean, is it worth it for, you know, 2% of the people who buy the game? It's a shame, because I think, you know, these environments could lend themselves so well to like ambisonic setups and those sorts of things. I think it could be incredible, but yeah. We'll need a lot more money, I think.
You mentioned before about the footsteps and how it changes the actual gameplay. Do you have any other good example of like sound implemented as a game mechanic by itself?
Yes, I mean, also in Counter-Strike you find that some of the heavier weapons will have like wider radiuses, so that you know, they're high power, they've got lots of ammunition, but the weakness is they take a long time to reload, and also they're more audible over a larger area, so you know, you're more vulnerable when you're reloading, so those kind of things. In terms of others off the top of my head, it's driven by sound. There's, say, Limbo, for example. I don't know if you've played that at all. So Limbo's it's a platform game, and it's so kind of like a Mario type game, and there's various puzzles that you have to solve on the way, and as you enter the puzzles, the ambiences kind of break down and become more abstract. So initially they're kind of quite realistic in a way, like trying to recreate the sound of the actual environment that you're currently in. And as you progress through the puzzles, they become less and less abstract until you come back to normal. So it's not really driving gameplay, but it's a good reflection as to, you know, where you are in that puzzle and how far through you are solving it. Yeah, I think off the top of my head, that's thanks for that. It's a good question.
I'm going to ask a question that I'm surprised nobody else here has yet asked. Have you done any sound design for the PS4 yet, and if so, on what games?
Yeah, well, so we're Guerrilla Studio, so I've only just started working on it, but we're working on Killzone 4, Shadowfall for PS4, which should be out pretty soon. Yeah.
Might not be a question, perhaps you can answer for Sony or whatever, but does the conversion between different consoles present any problems, i.e. from PlayStation to Xbox and PC?
It depends on lots of different things, really. I mean, if you've got if you're using audio middleware, like WIs, like I mentioned earlier, there's a few different other versions of that sort of software, like Fmod, that will sit between the game, and you just choose what format you're building for, and it will just compile it and chuck it out and put it in the game, sort of thing. But of course, there's going to be different amounts of RAM over the different systems, and if you're developing for Wii in contrast to PS3, I mean, there's quite a disparity in terms of the amount of like RAM and CPU and everything else, and so yeah, you've got to sort of weigh these things up and gauge them differently. For things like PC, that's why anytime you play a game on a PC, there's so many customizable different options, whether you can turn down the draw distance or the number of polygons or like the details of shadows or all these different things. Like, it's all scalable because there's such a wide variety of machines, and quite often system specifications will encompass quite a lot, from the latest tech to machines that are quite a few years old. So yeah, it's a massive thing, and for audio it does affect it. But that it really comes down to those ideas of what if you've got a core idea of what you're trying to attain with the sound design, then it should be regardless of platform. Like, you should be able to attain that. But that's where you figure out where you've just got to make the cuts and where you've got to focus your energies on, really.
Hi, two questions. One, what is the general turnaround for a big franchise game these days, and has that changed in the last half a decade?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you take things like it depends how from scratch it's coming as well. So the last game that we just finished, it's out today actually, which is Killzone Mercenary, which is on the Vita, which is the portable Sony console at the moment. That was an existing game with an existing engine, but it was quite a scaled down platform in terms of the hardware. It's quite powerful, the Vita, but it's not really near the horsepower of PS3. So actually, from getting all the technical aspects sorted out and to developing the game and to actual release, it was roughly about 3 years, which is an incredible amount of time for a handheld game, especially in a day where everyone's got iPhones in their pockets and there's a huge number of games to choose from on a device that fits in your pocket. For larger franchise things, I mean, if you're developing a game from complete scratch, it depends whether you reuse an engine like, say, the Cry engine used for the Crysis series of games, or the Frostbite engine, which is used for Battlefield games, which actually EA are now using for a huge selection of games, whether it be Command and Conquer, and it's being used as the basis for so many different things because it's proven to be robust and provide good results in a development background. But that's going to dramatically decrease the amount of time you're going to have to spend developing a game. But I was having a conversation about this with a friend who works in film, and he just cannot believe that we spend years working on these things and just one project and over and reiterating things. So yeah, it is. I think in terms of the entertainment industry, you're probably way more on games than anything else you might work on.
Thanks. And second quick question. Is the balance of RAM allocated to the sound team kind of a reflection of what happens with the budget of the whole game itself?
No, I think you're always stuck with much less than you really need. But, it's... Again, it depends what you're trying to do, and sometimes they can move about, and if you just definitely don't have enough RAM to be able to do it, there's always that opportunity to be able to say, hey, come on, this is what we've got to achieve, this is just not doable. The thing is what's surprising is every time one of these new consoles come out, it's basically like by a factor of 10 that our RAM resources increase. So you look at the PlayStation 2, it's about 2 meg, and PlayStation 3 it's about 20, and for PlayStation 4 we're talking about maybe 200 meg of audio RAM. I can't even comprehend what to do with that. That's nearly a third of a CD. And yeah, exactly. But you find something, and then after a few years, you're stuck in the same position. So it's yeah, you know, I guess it seems funny as well that just at the time when memory is going to become less and less of an issue, all of a sudden we're starting thinking about, oh wait, so we could physically model all of this, and then we use CPU time and we're using less memory, when all of a sudden we've got, you know, a factor of 10 times more than we just had. So yeah, it'll never be right and it'll never be enough.
Just to put it in scale, what sort of manpower would you have for these sort of time periods you've mentioned?
It scales quite a bit towards the end of the project when you might need more people on. There's probably a core team of maybe 3 or 4. It really depends on the size of the production, but I mean, that would include just somebody for day-to-day management, and sort of just to oversee and make sure that we're sort of following some sort of contingent plan. 2 sound designers who will implement that plan, and an audio programmer.
And there's probably quite a lot of interaction between your engineers that are doing it.
Yes, definitely, yeah.
What advice would you give to like audio engineering students that perhaps wanted to get into the gaming industry as sound designers?
I mean it's changed quite a lot. I think because it was sort of such an emerging industry and such a small thing at first, like it was quite sort of technical people got involved, and it was people who, you know, I don't know, could program a SID chip to make music on, you know. But like now, as things have completely changed and we're like actually recording samples and all the rest of it, there's people come from a huge amount of backgrounds.
Actually, can I just step in and give one piece of advice? Apart from the best result you can get here, I think possibly the best bit of practical advice I can offer you is to get out there and start building a sample library of your own. Because if you've got something to sell when you go to these people, even though they may not end up using your product, it shows that you're out there doing the job and that you're keen to get in there. So you're selling them the idea of your intellectual property, if you like. That's my advice. A showreel. Yeah, everybody's got a showreel. That's your showreel.
Not only that, a lot of these third-party tools are available for free for students and stuff. And so, for example, say Unity, which is a 3D game engine, which is quite often used for, well, all sorts of games. I mean, it will build to PS3 and it will build to, you know, PC and iPhone and all these different things, and you can create whole games inside of it, and then you can implement sounds into it. And to just create like a base platform with somebody running around and a few bits of geometry and a bridge or whatever, you know, I mean, it's actually pretty simple to use. And then to use that as like an interactive showcase for your actual sound design and your work and your understanding of recording sounds and creating it for that environment, when you can't really get any better than that. Not only that, it'll run in a browser, so you can put it on the internet and be like, there's my portfolio, and it's 3D and it's interactive and you can play it. So that's definitely stuff that will impress, those sort of things. Like, but yeah, WYs, Fmods, they're free, anyone can use them, and they're the industry tools. And so many people now with these third part, this is what sort of been missing in the games industry. Like if you're going to work in film and you want to jump onto a production, then they're probably going to be using Uendo or Pro Tools. So if you know them, you can just jump in and help out. Whereas on a game, it's like you've got to know the tools. But now they've become middleware and they're freely available. Like anyone can jump on them, learn them, and then instantly, like, you're more qualified than the next person. And in fact, you know, a lot of people in the industry haven't used those tools as well. And where they're quickly becoming dominant, you know, there is that risk of pushing people out. So, you know, those are the tools to be up on, definitely, particularly WIs.
You mentioned your hesitancy to pursue physical modeling because of the CPU, but do you kind of see any alternative options for like improving sound in games?
I don't know. It just really depends on, you know, what is the importance of those physical sounds and how often are you going to hear them, and I just kind of think that if you were working on a film and there was a bit where you had this big bold character that walks in, and you can use his footsteps to add emphasis to that character. If you've got physical modelling in place and that system's pretty rigid and it's just going, well, this is the velocity of the foot and this is the surface of the floor and this is the surface of the shoes and therefore this is what the sound is, it's like it's a bit too literal. All of a sudden you've lost the sound design, the aesthetic, and that's really where I'll be a bit apprehensive about something like physical modelling. Yeah.
May there also be a political reason for that apprehension? Because there is this big philosophical divide between the aesthetic sound designers and the programmer.
Yeah.
And physical modelling and algorithms really involve a combination of the two arts. Perhaps sound studios aren't equipped to deal with that.
Yeah, that's true. And I think also, from my perspective, like, what do I want to be doing? Do I want to be fine-tuning a physical modelling synthesizer that creates impact sounds, or do I want to be out just recording them? Because at the end of the day, that's more fun, and arguably you get better results. I don't know. I guess it depends on the repetition factor, and that's that. But I'd rather get a microphone and do it myself.
It doesn't necessarily have to be exclusive, though, right? You could have a combination of both samples to derive your design and your characteristics of the sound, and then in some ways, like, synthesize certain aspects to make it sound less repetitive.
Yeah, absolutely. And that again comes down to like the implementation, like how important are these sounds? Because all of a sudden, then you're doing two jobs in place of one. Like, so how important are those footstep sounds, and are other things going to start suffering as a result? But yeah, it's completely feasible, and in fact, I think that's in most of the sense of the way the sound seed stuff with WYs works, is that it is quite often layered with other things. We don't use it at all at the moment.
I got the impression it wasn't used that much.
No, I mean, I've had a few friends who've used it and they've said exactly as you suggested, that they layer it with other things, because for certain things that are quite resonant, I think it's meant to be quite good. Like metal impacts type thing, but as soon as it gets a bit dull and a bit more, I don't know, broader base in terms of its spectral content, then it all gets a bit confusing, and yeah, I don't think it manages it as well.
Should we close the questions now? We could actually take more questions after the meeting, if that's all right. You can continue speaking to Iain. It's now about 8:30, isn't it? Thank you very, very much for that.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I'll never look at Tetris in the same way again. I'll be forever shipping dissidents to the gulag. Thank you for that image. It's the exquisite fractal complexity of a game that's ostensibly about shooting people in the face is quite breathtaking, isn't it? So thank you very much for your lecture and for putting together so much material as well.
Cool, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And last thanks to the SAE for lending us this venue tonight, very kindly.